Table of Contents. Chapter 1. Introduction. Purpose of the book. Background on the conflict. Chapter 2. Historical context. Ukraine's history leading up to the conflict. Key events and developments in the region. Chapter 3. Causes of the conflict. Political and economic factors. Role of external actors. Chapter 4. The war on the ground. Overview of military operations. Humanitarian impact of the conflict. Chapter 05. International response. Diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict.
Lives have been lost.
Role of international organizations and key countries. Chapter 6. Current status of the conflict. Overview of the current situation. Prospects for a resolution. Chapter 7. Conclusion. Summary of key findings. Recommendations for the future. Chapter 1. Introduction. The war in Ukraine is one of the most complex and challenging conflicts of the 21st century. Despite ongoing efforts to bring an end to the violence, the conflict continues to escalate, with devastating consequences for the people of Ukraine and the wider region. In this book, we will examine the causes of the conflict, the key events and developments that have shaped the conflict, and the ongoing challenges faced by Ukraine as it struggles to establish peace and stability in the region. Purpose of The Hidden Truths of the Ukraine War. The purpose of the book is to provide a comprehensive and impartial overview of the conflict in Ukraine. This could include offering a detailed examination of the events leading up to the conflict, including the political, economic, and social factors that contributed to the outbreak of violence, providing a clear understanding of the war on the ground, including the military operations, humanitarian impact, and the role of various actors, such as the Ukrainian government, separatist groups, and international organizations assessing the international response to the conflict, including diplomatic efforts to resolve the crisis and the role of key countries, such as Russia and the European Union, examining the current status of the conflict, including the prospects for a resolution and the impact of the conflict on the region and beyond, providing new insights and perspectives on the conflict, and presenting evidence-based analysis of key issues and debates. The ultimate goal of the book is to provide a comprehensive and accessible overview of the conflict in Ukraine, and to promote greater understanding and dialogue around this important issue. The Hidden Truths of the Ukraine War is to provide a comprehensive and accessible overview of the conflict in Ukraine, and to promote greater understanding and dialogue around this important issue. The book aims to shed light on the underlying factors and motivations driving the conflict, and to provide a balanced and objective analysis of the events and developments on the ground. By presenting a nuanced perspective on the ongoing crisis, the book aims to contribute to the ongoing efforts to find a peaceful resolution to the conflict. Additionally, the book aims to address the numerous misunderstandings and misperceptions that have surrounded the conflict in Ukraine, by presenting accurate and reliable information based on extensive research and analysis. The book is intended for a broad audience, including policymakers, academics, journalists, and concerned citizens, who are seeking a deeper understanding of the conflict in Ukraine and its implications for the region and beyond. Through its comprehensive and accessible approach, The Hidden Truths of the Ukraine War seeks to play a role in fostering greater awareness and understanding of the conflict in Ukraine, and to contribute to the ongoing efforts to find a lasting and peaceful resolution to this complex and pressing issue. Background of the conflict in Ukraine. Origin of the conflict. The conflict in Ukraine has its roots in political and economic disputes between Ukraine and Russia, as well as historical tensions between the two countries. The conflict began in 2014, following the Euromaidan protests and the subsequent fall of the Ukrainian government. Key events. Some of the key events that led to the conflict include the 2014 Ukrainian Revolution and the subsequent annexation of Crimea by Russia, the outbreak of violence in eastern Ukraine, and the ongoing fighting between Ukrainian government forces and separatist groups in the Donbas region. Parties involved. The conflict in Ukraine involves several key players, including the Ukrainian government, separatist groups in eastern Ukraine, Russia, and various international organizations, such as the European Union and the United Nations. Key issues. The conflict in Ukraine is complex and multifaceted, with a range of political, economic, and social issues at play. Some of the key issues include Ukraine's relationship with Russia, the status of Crimea, the conflict in the Donbas region, and the broader geopolitical dynamics in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. Chapter 2. Historical context. Ukraine's history leading up to the conflict. Key events and developments in the region. Ukraine's history. To understand the conflict in Ukraine, it is important to have a basic understanding of the country's history and its relationship with Russia. This could include the country's history as part of the Soviet Union, its independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and its struggle to establish its independence and establish a democratic government. Key events and developments in the region. It is also important to examine key events and developments in the region that have contributed to the conflict. This could include the collapse of the Soviet Union, the establishment of independent states in Eastern Europe, and the ongoing geopolitical struggles between Russia and the West. Tensions between Ukraine and Russia. A central aspect of the historical context of the conflict is the tension between Ukraine and Russia, including disputes over gas supplies, economic integration, and cultural identity. This includes the political, economic, and cultural differences between Ukraine and Russia, and the ways in which these differences have contributed to the conflict. Ukraine's history. Ukraine has a long and rich history, dating back to ancient times, when it was inhabited by various tribes and later became part of the Kievan Rus, a powerful medieval state. In the late 18th century, Ukraine became part of the Russian Empire, and remained part of the Soviet Union from 1922 to 1991. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine declared independence and established itself as a sovereign state. In the post-Soviet era, Ukraine faced many challenges as it sought to establish its independence, build a democratic government, and develop a market economy. This included political instability, economic hardship, and ongoing disputes with Russia over issues such as gas supplies and cultural identity. In 2013, protests erupted in Kiev after the Ukrainian government backed out of a deal to deepen ties with the European Union in favor of closer ties with Russia. The protests, known as Euromaidan, led to the fall of the Ukrainian government and the outbreak of the conflict in eastern Ukraine. Key events and developments in the region that contributed to the conflict in Ukraine. Collapse of the Soviet Union. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked a major turning point in the region, leading to the establishment of independent states in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. East-West tensions. The post-Soviet era was marked by ongoing tensions between Russia and the West, including disputes over NATO expansion, the expansion of Western influence in the region, and the ongoing conflict in the Balkans. Ukraine's relationship with the EU and NATO. Ukraine's relationship with the European Union and NATO has been a key factor in the conflict. Ukraine's decision to pursue closer ties with the EU and NATO has been a major source of tension with Russia, and has contributed to the outbreak of the conflict in eastern Ukraine. Russia's assertiveness in the region. In recent years, Russia has become increasingly assertive in the region, including its annexation of Crimea and its support for separatist groups in eastern Ukraine. This has contributed to ongoing tensions between Russia and the West, and has raised concerns about the stability of the region. The UN and EU have both employed diplomatic efforts, sanctions, and peacekeeping missions in an attempt to de-escalate tensions and find a peaceful resolution to the conflict. The UN has passed several resolutions calling for an end to the fighting and respect for Ukraine's territorial integrity, while the EU has imposed economic sanctions on Russia and provided support to Ukraine. Despite these efforts, the conflict has persisted and the situation remains volatile. The role of external actors, including the US, NATO, and various European countries, has also been a major factor in shaping the international response to the conflict. Chapter 3. Causes of the conflict. Political and economic factors. Role of external actors. Euromaidan protests. The Euromaidan protests in Kiev in 2013 were a major trigger for the conflict in Ukraine. The protests, which erupted after the Ukrainian government backed out of a deal to deepen ties with the European Union in favor of closer ties with Russia, led to the fall of the Ukrainian government and the outbreak of the conflict in eastern Ukraine. The Euromaidan protest was a series of demonstrations and civil unrest that took place in Kiev, Ukraine from November 2013 to February 2014. The protests were sparked by the Ukrainian government's decision to back out of a deal to deepen ties with the European Union in favor of closer ties with Russia. The protests quickly grew into a wider movement calling for political change and greater European integration. The Euromaidan protests eventually led to the fall of the Ukrainian government and the outbreak of the conflict in eastern Ukraine. The protests represented a major turning point in Ukrainian history, and were a key factor in the conflict that has since plagued the country. The Euromaidan protests also demonstrated the strength of popular discontent in Ukraine and the desire for change in the country. Russian intervention, including the annexation of Crimea and support for separatist groups in eastern Ukraine, has been a major cause of the conflict. Russia's actions have raised concerns about its intentions in the region and have contributed to ongoing tensions between Russia and the West. Russian intervention refers to actions taken by the Russian government in Ukraine, including the annexation of Crimea and support for separatist groups in eastern Ukraine. The intervention has been a major cause of the conflict in Ukraine, and has raised concerns about Russia's intentions in the region. In 2014, Russian forces annexed Crimea from Ukraine, a move that was widely condemned by the international community. The annexation of Crimea was a major escalation of the conflict in Ukraine and has contributed to ongoing tensions between Russia and the West. In addition to the annexation of Crimea, Russia has also provided support for separatist groups in eastern Ukraine. This support has included the provision of military equipment and personnel, and has helped to prolong the conflict in the region. The Russian intervention has been a major factor in the conflict in Ukraine, and has raised concerns about Russia's role in the region and its intentions towards Ukraine and its neighbors. Political instability in Ukraine, including ongoing disputes between the government and opposition, has contributed to the conflict. The lack of a strong and stable government has made it difficult for Ukraine to address the challenges it faces, including the conflict in the east. Political instability refers to a lack of stability in the government or political system of a country. In Ukraine, political instability has been a major contributor to the conflict that has plagued the country in recent years, following the Euromaidan protests and the fall of the Ukrainian government in 2014. Ukraine has faced ongoing political instability, including disputes between the government and opposition, corruption, and a lack of political consensus on key issues. This political instability has made it difficult for Ukraine to address the challenges it faces, including the conflict in the east, and has contributed to the ongoing struggles faced by the country. Political instability can also lead to a lack of confidence in the government and its institutions, and can make it difficult for the government to effectively address the needs of its citizens. In Ukraine, political instability has contributed to the ongoing conflict and has made it difficult for the country to establish peace and stability in the region. Economic hardship, including high levels of poverty and unemployment, has contributed to the conflict. The difficult economic conditions have made it difficult for Ukraine to address the challenges it faces, including the conflict in the east. Economic factors have played a significant role in the conflict in Ukraine. Some of the key economic factors include competition for resources. Ukraine and Russia have long competed for resources, including energy resources and access to ports. This competition has been a major source of tension between the two countries. Competition for economic influence. The conflict in Ukraine is also driven by competition for economic influence in the region. Both Ukraine and Russia have sought to gain economic influence in the region, and this competition has been a major source of tension. Economic integration with Europe. Ukraine's pursuit of economic integration with Europe has been a key factor in the conflict. Russia views Ukraine's integration with Europe as a threat to its own economic interests and has sought to prevent it. Dependence on Russia for energy. Ukraine is heavily dependent on Russia for its energy supplies, and this dependence has been a source of tension between the two countries. Russia has used its control over Ukraine's energy supplies as leverage in the conflict. The economic factors that have contributed to the conflict in Ukraine are complex and interrelated, and they have contributed to the escalating tensions between Ukraine and Russia. These economic factors have played a significant role in driving the conflict, and they will likely continue to play a role in determining the outcome of the conflict. Some of the key economic factors include competition for resources. Ukraine and Russia have long competed for resources, including energy resources and access to ports. This competition has been a major source of tension between the two countries. Competition for economic influence. The conflict in Ukraine is also driven by competition for economic influence in the region. Both Ukraine and Russia have sought to gain economic influence in the region, and this competition has been a major source of tension. Economic integration with Europe. Ukraine's pursuit of economic integration with Europe has been a key factor in the conflict. Russia views Ukraine's integration with Europe as a threat to its own economic interests and has sought to prevent it. Dependence on Russia for energy. Ukraine is heavily dependent on Russia for its energy supplies, and this dependence has been a source of tension between the two countries. Russia has used its control over Ukraine's energy supplies as leverage in the conflict. The economic factors that have contributed to the conflict in Ukraine are complex and interrelated, and they have contributed to the escalating tensions between Ukraine and Russia. These economic factors have played a significant role in driving the conflict, and they will likely continue to play a role in determining the outcome of the conflict. Role of external actors. The role of external actors, including other countries and international organizations, has been significant in the conflict in Ukraine. Some of the key external actors and their roles include Russia. Russia has been a major external actor in the conflict in Ukraine, and its intervention has been a major driver of the conflict. Russia annexed Crimea and supported separatist groups in eastern Ukraine, and it has used its military and economic influence to destabilize the Ukrainian government. European Union. The European Union has been a major diplomatic player in the conflict in Ukraine and has provided economic and political support to the Ukrainian government. The EU has also imposed sanctions on Russia in response to its intervention in Ukraine. United States. The United States has also been a major diplomatic player in the conflict in Ukraine and has provided political and military support to the Ukrainian government. The U.S. has also imposed sanctions on Russia in response to its intervention in Ukraine. United Nations. The United Nations has been involved in diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict in Ukraine, and it has played a role in coordinating humanitarian aid efforts. These external actors have had a significant impact on the conflict in Ukraine, and their actions have contributed to the escalation of tensions in the region. The involvement of external actors has made the conflict in Ukraine complex and difficult to resolve, and their continued involvement will likely play a role in determining the outcome of the conflict. They also discuss the role of military operations and their impact on the region. Furthermore, this book provides analysis of the political and economic factors driving the conflict, including the influence of external actors, such as the EU and the US. The conflict in Ukraine has had a significant impact on the country and its people, with thousands of casualties, displacement, and economic hardship as a result of the fighting. The humanitarian situation in the conflict-affected areas is particularly dire, with limited access to basic services such as healthcare, water, and sanitation, and a high level of vulnerability among civilians. The conflict has also had a broader regional impact, with Russia and Ukraine's relationship with the West being greatly strained as a result of the conflict. Diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict have been ongoing, with numerous rounds of negotiations taking place between the parties involved. The most notable of these was the Minsk Agreement, which was signed in February 2015 and aimed to end the fighting and establish a lasting peace in the region. However, the implementation of the agreement has been slow, and sporadic outbreaks of violence have continued to occur, undermining progress towards a lasting resolution to the conflict. The role of external actors in the conflict has been a major point of contention, with Russia being accused of providing military and financial support to separatist groups in the Donbass region, while the West has provided political and economic support to the Ukrainian government. The situation has further escalated tensions between Russia and the West, and has contributed to a wider geopolitical crisis in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. In terms of the international response, the United Nations and the European Union have been involved in trying to resolve the conflict and promote peace. The UN has established a peacekeeping mission in Ukraine, while the EU has imposed economic sanctions on Russia in response to its involvement in the conflict. The involvement of international organizations and key countries, such as the US and Germany, will likely continue to play a role in shaping the outcome of the conflict. In conclusion, the conflict in Ukraine remains a complex and ongoing issue, with numerous political, economic, and military factors contributing to the conflict. The impact of the conflict on the country, the region, and the international community highlights the importance of finding a lasting resolution to the conflict. Despite ongoing diplomatic efforts, the prospects for a resolution remain uncertain, and the involvement of external actors will likely continue to play a key role in shaping the outcome of the conflict. Chapter 4. The War on the Ground. Overview of military operations. Humanitarian impact of the conflict. The war in Ukraine, also known as the War in Donbass, has been ongoing since 2014 and is being fought in the southeastern region of the country, particularly in the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, provinces. The conflict is between Ukrainian government forces and pro-Russian separatists who are seeking independence from Ukraine. The war on the ground is characterized by intense fighting, heavy artillery and missile attacks, and a large number of civilian casualties. The conflict has resulted in widespread destruction of infrastructure, including homes, businesses, and public buildings, and has forced thousands of people to flee their homes. The war has also resulted in widespread human rights abuses, including extrajudicial killings, torture, and forced disappearances. In addition to the ongoing fighting, the war has also led to a humanitarian crisis in the region, with a large number of civilians facing food and medicine shortages, as well as limited access to clean water and other basic necessities. The conflict has also disrupted the local economy, leading to high levels of unemployment and poverty. Despite efforts to find a peaceful resolution to the conflict, the war on the ground continues to escalate, with both sides showing little willingness to compromise. The conflict remains one of the most pressing challenges facing Ukraine and the wider region, and a lasting solution to the conflict remains elusive. The war in Ukraine has had a devastating impact on the country and its people. The conflict has resulted in over 13,000 deaths and has displaced over 1 million people. The situation on the ground remains tense, with sporadic outbreaks of fighting and increased casualties. The conflict has had a profound impact on the civilian population, particularly in the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, provinces, where the conflict has been most intense. Many civilians have been directly affected by the violence and have faced food and medicine shortages, as well as limited access to basic necessities. The humanitarian situation in the region remains dire, and many civilians continue to face difficult conditions. On the ground, military operations are characterized by sporadic outbreaks of violence and sporadic ceasefire agreements. Ukrainian government forces continue to face off against pro-Russian separatists in the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, and the conflict has resulted in significant damage to infrastructure and homes in the region. The situation remains volatile, and sporadic outbreaks of violence continue to occur. Despite numerous ceasefire agreements, the situation on the ground remains tense and the prospects for a resolution to the conflict remain uncertain. The humanitarian situation in the region remains dire, and the international community must continue to support efforts to address the humanitarian crisis and find a lasting solution to the conflict. Chapter 5. International Response. Diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict. Role of international organizations and key countries. The international response to the war in Ukraine has been largely diplomatic in nature, with numerous international organizations and key countries working to find a peaceful resolution to the conflict. The United Nations has been involved in the conflict since its inception, with the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council passing several resolutions condemning the violence and calling for a peaceful resolution to the conflict. The UN has also deployed several special envoys to the region to facilitate peace talks between the parties involved. The European Union has been a key player in the diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict, with the EU playing a leading role in the negotiations that led to the signing of the Minsk II agreement in 2015. The EU has also imposed economic sanctions on Russia in response to its annexation of Crimea and its support for the separatists in eastern Ukraine. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, has been playing a critical role in monitoring the ceasefire agreement and reporting on human rights abuses and the humanitarian situation in the region. Key countries, including Germany, France, and the United States, have also been involved in diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict. These countries have supported peace talks and have imposed economic sanctions on Russia in response to its actions in Ukraine. Despite these diplomatic efforts, the conflict in Ukraine remains unresolved, and tensions between the parties involved continue to escalate. The role of international organizations and key countries in resolving the conflict remains critical, as the situation on the ground continues to deteriorate. Chapter 6. Current status of the conflict. Overview of the current situation. Prospects for a resolution. As of 2023, the war in Ukraine remains ongoing, with sporadic outbreaks of violence and sporadic ceasefire agreements. The current status of the conflict is characterized by ongoing military operations, with Ukrainian government forces facing off against pro-Russian separatists in the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, provinces. The conflict has resulted in over 13,000 deaths and has displaced over 2 million people. The current situation in Ukraine is complex, with both sides accusing each other of violating the ceasefire agreements and engaging in acts of violence. The situation on the ground remains tense, with sporadic outbreaks of fighting and increased casualties. The humanitarian situation in the region remains dire, with large numbers of civilians facing food and medicine shortages, as well as limited access to basic necessities. The prospects for a resolution to the conflict remain uncertain, as the parties involved show little willingness to compromise. Efforts to find a peaceful resolution to the conflict through diplomatic channels have been unsuccessful, and the situation on the ground continues to deteriorate. The international community, including the United Nations, the European Union, and key countries such as Germany, France, and the United States, continue to support diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict and call for a peaceful resolution to the crisis. However, the conflict remains one of the most pressing challenges facing Ukraine and the wider region, and a lasting solution to the conflict remains elusive. Chapter 7. Conclusion. Summary of key findings. Recommendations for the future. In conclusion, the war in Ukraine is a complex and ongoing conflict that has had a profound impact on the country and its people. The conflict has its roots in historical tensions between Ukraine and Russia, as well as the political instability that followed the Euromaidan protests. The Russian intervention in Ukraine, and its subsequent annexation of Crimea, has only served to escalate the conflict and make a resolution more difficult to achieve. Despite numerous diplomatic efforts by international organizations and key countries, the conflict remains unresolved, and the situation on the ground continues to deteriorate. The humanitarian situation in the region remains dire, and the prospects for a resolution to the conflict remain uncertain. In summary, the war in Ukraine highlights the importance of addressing historical tensions, political instability, and regional conflicts, in order to promote peace and stability in the region. The international community must continue to support diplomatic efforts to find a peaceful resolution to the conflict and address the humanitarian crisis in the region. It is recommended that the international community continue to support diplomatic efforts to find a lasting solution to the conflict and address the humanitarian crisis in the region. This could include increased economic and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, as well as continued efforts to promote political stability and dialogue between the parties involved. It is also important that the international community work to prevent the further escalation of the conflict and ensure that the human rights of all those affected by the conflict are protected.